Hi, my name is Kristina MacNeil, and I'm a researcher in Varto, a Centre for Sami Research at Umeå University. And just to clarify, Sami people are the Indigenous people of Sweden. I'm going to talk to you today about some lesser known consequences of extractivism and extractive violence. That is, connections between extractive violence and lateral violence, also known as intragroup conflict. I am an interdisciplinary researcher. I have a background in peace and conflict research, ethnology and Indigenous research. I conduct projects together with Sami communities in Sweden, as well as Aboriginal communities in Australia, and recently also with First Nations communities in Canada. In my research, I collaborate with Indigenous peoples around their experiences of different forms of violence connected to extractivism on their lands. Today, however, I will focus on Sami reindeer herding communities in northern Sweden. Now, Indigenous communities around the world have vastly different climates, cultures, social situations, and geographic locations. But one thing that they share is a history of colonialism and their lands being colonised. Furthermore, they share a current situation of large-scale extractivism on their lands. This is something that is felt by Indigenous peoples globally, and it is something that is being protested. In here you can see photos from the US, from Canada, Japan, Australia, Brazil, and Sweden, to show just a few places. Indigenous voices are being heard globally, protesting the destruction of their lands. For Leavas reindeer herding Sami community that I have collaborated closely with for a number of years, and which is located in the Kiruna area, which is up north in Sweden. Here, extractivism is particularly present. Leavas has the world's largest underground iron ore mine on their reindeer grazing lands. This mine is so big and it's basically taking its toll on the entire community, so much so that the town of Kiruna now parts of it is actually being moved. This picture is taken by Nila Inga. He was then the chair of Leavas reindeer herding Sami community. The reindeer is a migratory animal. They follow their migratory routes. And when Nila and I lecture together and he shows this picture, he always points out that there is a little calf behind that last female. And he will say that that poor little creature must wonder where it got born, because it should be born where it's green and where the land is healthy. But this is where it actually ended up coming out. This is quite representative of what's happening to reindeer herding and reindeer husbandry all over Sweden today. Extractive industries and extractive activities are taking their toll: mining, wind farms, forestry, hydropower, and even tourism. It puts enormous pressure on Sami reindeer herders, on reindeer husbandry, on the reindeer, and on Sami societies for a number of different reasons. Now, in my work with Indigenous communities around the experiences of extractivism, I've used a model based on Johan Galtung's violence triangle. This is a classic model which you might recognise. And here Galtung explains structural violence as injustice and exploitation built into a social system. Direct violence is here explained as the physical or psychological violence or threats of violence. That is what we normally think of when we hear the word violence. And the cultural violence is explained as the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that justify and legitimise the structural and direct violence that make it seem almost natural. The three are always at interplay. They affect and they underpin each other. Now, I mainly work with interview data. In my PhD research, I collaborated with Leavas reindeer herding Sami community and also with the Adimana community in South Australia. And I then found that the research participants on both sides of the globe shared strong evidence of structural and cultural violence in their experiences and interactions with extractive industries. However, there was no direct evidence of the type of direct violence that Johan Galtung talks about. Yet, all the hours that I had of shared voices and experiences talked about a direct violence to the land that manifested in the people. And this is amazingly important. As a non-Indigenous person, I have been very fortunate to learn from Indigenous friends and mentors, elders, and supervisors about how central the connection between people and land really is. One of my former supervisors and mentor and friend, Jillian Marsh, an Adni Matna woman herself, and you will hear from her later in this presentation. She says that Muda is the unique spiritual link between Adni and Matna Yuras and Yata and cultural resources. Our current director at Vartue, Christer Stor, he talks about yoik, or Sami song, as having a similar function. The one who yoiks a place, a river, a person, stands in close relation to these. You're not just at the side of it, you are the river's waters, its fish, and the person that is associated with this place. Emma Kowal, an Australian scholar, she writes about country in the context of Indigenous Australia as being a living creative entity with a deep ongoing relationship with the humans responsible for it. So this is different to the very passive imaginations of land or area that are common in Western context. Now, of course, there are differences between connections to country, connections to land, between Australia and Sapmi, for instance. However, there are also some striking similarities. And in order to honour this perspective that is so important and which is so invisible in Western imaginations and narratives around land and land ownership, I created a modified violence triangle with the inclusion of extractive violence in place of direct violence. And here extractive violence is defined as a type of violence against nature and or people and animals that is caused by extractivism and that primarily affects peoples closely connected to land. And here extractivism should be seen as more of an ideology, not just the extraction of natural resources and the export of these, which is a common definition. I said that I was going to talk about the connections between extractive violence and lateral violence, so we'll get to that now. What then is lateral violence? Well, it is conflict or violence that happens within a group rather than with a counterparty, like the state, for example. It's a type of violence common within groups that are subjected to oppression. Sometimes it is called internalized colonialism. It's also been called horizontal violence. There are other terms for it as well. It originates from the theorists Frans Fanon and Paula Freire. They wrote about it in the 60s and 70s, predominantly in Africa and in Latin America. Expressions of lateral violence may be gossip, jealousy, shaming, verbal or physical attacks, sabotage, bullying, social exclusion, physical violence, etc. So it's pretty broad. The bulk of research on lateral violence has actually been carried out within the field of nursing. So if you Google it, that is what you will find. Lateral violence in Indigenous communities has been observed in predominantly Canada and Australia. And unfortunately, it then tends to be labelled an Indigenous problem, with the consequence that the actual causes of it are not investigated, and the dominant societies take little or no responsibility for their part in this, for the actual phenomena, and for finding ways to minimise it. And I'll finish up by illustrating what I've found to be some of the causes of lateral violence and how it connects and interacts with extractive violence, constructing a type of perpetual cycle. The cultural, structural and extractive violence, they all affect Indigenous communities and local communities for that matter, like Kiruna that we looked at earlier with the reindeer. Now, the pressure placed on a community by these three interacting creates lateral violence or intra-group conflict. The outside pressure becomes so big that members of the group strike out at each other. When the lateral violence is then observed, it is labelled an Indigenous or a rural community problem, which feeds straight back into the cultural violence, the racist attitudes that prevail within the dominant society, the discriminatory ideas that tell us that these people, these communities are prone to conflict or cannot handle their own matters, for instance. Now, the cultural violence feeds into and underpins the structural violence and in turn the extractive violence, creating more of that external pressure and thus fueling more of the lateral violence. So in this way, it becomes a perpetual cycle. And I think that in order to deal with and address lateral violence, it is of utmost importance that we start talking about and addressing the cultural, the structural and the extractive violence that can be and often are causes of lateral violence. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. My name's Melissa Nursey-Bray and I'm an Australian researcher investigating issues around community engagement, particularly into environmental management. And I spent a large number of years, I think almost 20 now, working with and for Indigenous communities across Australia. And today I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous agency, colonial extraction and adapting to climate change. This is based on the work that I've done working with a number of collaborative projects over the last 8 years with Indigenous peoples about climate change in Australia. And before I go ahead, I just would really like to make a few acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people on whose country I am speaking and living today, the elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge all the Arabana people of Central South Australia and all the other Indigenous groups in Australia whose perspectives actually underpin this work. I couldn't actually make this talk without them. And finally, I'd like to particularly acknowledge Robert Palmer, Philip Rist, Veronica Arben, Lester Irabuna-Rigney and Aaron Stewart, all of whom are co-authors that I've recently published some of this work I'd like to talk to you about today. I mean, first of all, Indigenous peoples in Australia observe and are experiencing a wide range of climate impacts. And some of those issues and some of those impacts are felt very keenly. But I'd like to just give you a quote from one of it exemplifies some of these issues. This is from a person in Udinadatta in South Australia. Bush flowers, it makes us sad. Things are not the same. We need to get out until we used to get out and get so many flowers, so many kinds. Now you only see a few, and you used to see whole areas in flower, and now we have nothing. And this is just a little snippet of multiple contexts where Indigenous peoples are experiencing a wide range of impacts, but they're also implementing a wide range of adaptations, from adaptation plans, seasonal calendars, fire burning programs, and knowledge programs. But one of the things that we found moving forward in working out how to seek to build Indigenous voices and active participation in decision-making fora is that across the board, despite a wide and diverse range of responses, Indigenous groups face ongoing challenges to be heard. And we're arguing that this is largely a result of ongoing colonial structures, modes of thinking and modes of extraction, which capture Indigenous peoples in policy frames within certain cultural tropes, and they inhibit through collaboration and co-management. One of the ways that this is happening, so what I want to do is take you now through just three different areas in which really feel these lines of extraction and colonisation are an active agent in contemporary Indigenous adaptation, not just to climate change, but environmental change generally. Now, one of the things that this is based on a project I did with the Arabana people, but it's something that we found across Australia and some of the other groups we worked with, is that the literature and policymakers tend to characterise Indigenous peoples as either vulnerable or resilient, and they tend to therefore capture Indigenous peoples as being weak or basically so resilient that you don't have to do anything else to work with them to sort it out. So you can see here that this is very different to the characterisations the Arabana people had about their own perceptions on adaptation and on climate change. So Western literature says Indigenous peoples are vulnerable. The Arabana people say, no, we have agency. We're not weak. Vulnerable, you say, always have been and always will be. Look, when you come to take our land away, when you come to talk to us about climate, well, you might have gotten burned in the sun, but we'll still be here. We're a strong people. We're not going anywhere. There's all this idea about survival as well, that Indigenous peoples are resilient. We survived colonisation. We are fragmented and damaged, but we survived. All that happened in such a small space of time. So how is that different too? Well, it's exactly the same as climate change. We'll adapt to that too, and maybe not unscathed, but we will survive. And then finally, the idea of adaptation, which is very constructed in the Western literature in a particular way. Indigenous peoples have ancient knowledge that can help them adapt. You know, Arabana people and a lot of people across Australia have said to us, well, adaptation is agency in action. But the idea of adaptation, well, you're a bit Johnny lately, come with that one. Arabana people have been adapting to change forever. You might try to take our language, our land, our customs, but we've survived all that. Now you want to help us adapt? Adaptation, get us jobs, get us some ranges, get us to look after this country. That'd be good. So the second point arising from that is this idea that in fact colonisation therefore both pre-constructs the terminology around how Indigenous peoples are constructed in the policy regime. But if you look at the modes of extraction across Australia, this is one of the areas where this is the Arabana country, and you'll see that the lines of extraction, this is through the development of the railway, but also of mining, and has basically traced through the Arabana country, moving Arabana people out of country, dispossessing them from country, and as you can see here, reconfiguring the places of settlement, not just in country, but all across Australia, from Adelaide up to Darwin and many places as well on top of that. And this sort of shows that, you know, the knowledge that Indigenous peoples wanted to talk to us about climate change, in fact, spread not just within Arabana country, but the entire line of the Garn Railway and the means of extraction. And this basically shows that Arabana people were trying to say to us and to policymakers, we can talk to you about climate change knowledge, but it's also colonial knowledge. It's knowledge that's drawn and observed across the last 200 and so years, all across the country. But all policymakers want to know is what are the Arabana people going to tell us about here? And that immediately renders the Indigenous voice invisible, where the policy and the knowledge is in fact across this wider domain. Policy implications for this is that the Indigenous knowledge that could be very useful in terms of environmental change and management is not just millennia old knowledge, but it's knowledge that's drawn on a colonial experience, which is derived in fact from dispossession and relocation. So that Indigenous climate knowledge can occur at wider scales and across places, including but also outside of Indigenous country. However, persistent bounding of the characterisations of Indigenous knowledge persists that people just want to talk to Indigenous peoples about country, and they have a preference for knowledge that's rooted in a millennia time scale, and that creates that invisibility and prohibits Indigenous input into current adaptation policy. The other thing it does, of course, is it ignores Indigenous claims and experiences of climate change in urban spaces. So many people in Australia, Indigenous peoples, actually now live in cities, and their experience of climate change in that context is also ignored. So my final reflection here is that I think Western and colonial derived narratives about Indigenous people, such as the different terminologies, the idea that country itself and within country is the only place that Indigenous peoples can be consulted on, and where Indigenous scale is not recognised, that inhibits the authentic incorporation of Indigenous voices into climate change policy. Of course, these aren't prescriptions. They're only based on a certain number of Indigenous groups that we've worked with. So no presumptions there, it'll apply to all Indigenous groups. But we do think it has implications not just for environmental policy and environmental change, but the ways and modes in which colonial forms of extraction over historical time affects how you construct place, scale and knowledge in Indigenous context. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my presentation today is about bushfires and dispossession, a pathway for repatriation of Indigenous views of climate change. My name's Jillian Marsh, I'm a member of the Adelaide community, and I'm here to share with you today some of my thoughts and experiences around the situation that we face here in Australia, and which is also faced by many other Indigenous peoples across the globe. On the next slide, we can see that this next slide of mine is about sovereignty never ceded, and the slide that I'm wanting you to bring your attention to relates to first of all an acknowledgement to people and country, and in doing that, I acknowledge that our panel meets today on the various lands of First Nations peoples who've never ceded their sovereign rights. And in my own language, in Yurangawana, I'd just like to say a very short welcome. So, Ngāti Waidimat the Urartu, Ngā Yarta Flinders Ranges, South Australia, Naram Inaari Kulin Yarta. So I'm an Adyamatna woman from the Flinders Ranges region of South Australia, and I acknowledge that this place called Melbourne or Naram is also the lands of the Kulin Nation, and that in all instances in Australia, sovereignty has never been ceded. If we just go to the next slide now, the next slide takes us to a slide called Theories of Dispossession. On this slide here, this slide is about giving us a contextual outlook of bushfires and dispossession. And so first of all, it looks at some of the terminology and what concepts they allude to, such as wildfire. As an Indigenous person, I see this as a component of the persisting discourses of land use. The term wildfire is something quite foreign to us, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. But it goes hand in hand with other examples such as terra nullius or empty land, and site area clearance, a phrase that's used quite commonly by the extractive industry in terms of site validation. It's also been imposed in the realm of negotiating native title Indigenous land use agreements. And another set of terminology is natural resources management, which a lot of us hear. And from an Indigenous standpoint, this for me is about the continuance of white privileging of Western science. Many of these terms are intrinsically linked to the theoretical constructs of colonial erasure and white agency. And in contrast to wildfire, our terminology is ardlawirti, which is the term that we use for fire in Central Australia, and it's tied in very much with cultural landscapes and how we've interacted with our landscape for millennia. So fire's a part of an integrated complexity that goes well beyond material and financial priorities. And one of the images on the screen here relates to Adyamatna cosmology, and it's the image up in the top right hand corner is Mukumai and Ardlawidni, the damper stick and fire sticks, and these represent ancient practices of how fire was valued and respected across all aspects of Australia's pre-contact and post-contact landscape in terms of regeneration of growth, improving weather patterns, and also the provision of warmth and a place to process food and other daily resources. On the next slide, if we go to the next slide, this one is about reclaiming custodianship through mura, our storylines and songlines. And Yuramalka is one of the terms that often comes up on my radar because it carries for me a sense of personal attachment to the engraved messages which validate our Adyamatna genealogy over a very long period of time. And these sites are often labelled in the English language in Wudjungawala as rock art galleries or rock art sites, promoting an aesthetic value that satisfies colonial values of heritage and at the same time undermining the Indigenous sense of significance. An Indigenous standpoint here insists on a connectivity between sites, often referred to as a storyline or songline. And Yuramalka also signifies a place where monuments from an ancient history can be found and recollections of our past lives and heroic events, revitalising links between the people of today with a proud and strong society, and also very much a cultural landscape that acts as the foundation for today's life forces. So rock art just does not cut it. It's actually a very diminishing term in my view. Our connections to the environment go beyond this, of course, and include other terminology like Allavari, the pathway in the sky, or the Milky Way constellation, as it's known to some people, and also the concept behind Yurayapa, or the ancient walkways that over millennia became major trade routes and exchange routes across Australia and the adjoining waters. In the next slide now, the next slide is about threats to economies of sovereign peoples. And on this slide, again, I wanted to discuss some of the terminology that's quite prevalent here, including economic assimilation, as colonial contestation is repeatedly reinforced by government agencies of corporate power brokers. Our national resources continue to shrink until, as we are now, we're reaching crisis point. The assimilation into a non-sustainable economy is becoming increasingly evident, as is the assimilatory process of negotiating Indigenous land use agreements through the process used here in Australia, which I mentioned earlier, native title. The next bit of terminology that I wanted to reflect on was akurawi, which is our term for the sacred water that emerges from the ground. So this is the spring water that comes up from the ground. According to Adyamatna cosmologies or creations, akurawi is central to our way of knowing and being and doing the right thing and the respectful thing to maintain our most precious life-sustaining resource in this continent, which is water. Yartawarnditha is another term that often comes to mind with me, and it relates to land care in a general sense. Yartawarnditha is the intellectual and dynamic capacity of philosophical doing in relation to caring for country in a marginalised Western scientific paradigm. And I think that Indigenous worldviews have to come to the forefront if we're actually going to bring terminology and enactments like Yartawarnditha, which is actually caring for the land and speaking for the country, looking after the country. We need to bring these terms back to the forefront of our thinking. The other term that I wanted to touch on here is called Yurawimala, and Yurawimala is a very strong, culturally driven way of interacting with each other when it comes to making decisions. When we come to discussing things and making decisions, Yurawimala is our way of doing business based on strong and respectful governance. It's tied very much to our old ways of doing business that date back to pre-contact times. But there are some very good key principles in there that we're still using today, but often just don't get recognised as being valid ways of doing business. We want to go back to doing business the way that suits us. And yes, we can do that when we're in our own settings, in our own spaces. But when it comes to negotiating outside of our own spaces, we get constantly oppressed by not being able to practice the principles behind Umeå. And so the ongoing colonial violence around oppression of country, people and culture continues. If we move now to the next slide revisits a theory based on race biology, and this theory has been around for a long time. It's often referred to as social Darwinism or race biology, and it's now largely discredited in many of these types of settings where we go to conferences or we teach Indigenous studies at university setting. But in practice, social Darwinism is very persistent. It still influences colonised countries like Australia in all sorts of different ways, and we find that Indigenous expertise as a result is still largely destined to be regarded as non-credible, simplistic, or not in sync with government and industry priorities. And often the injustices suffered by Indigenous Australians over the past 250 years is based on this concept of natural selection, which reminds us again of the warped interpretations of how Darwin's theory of evolution was actually repurposed to oppress Indigenous people. And we now realise that the survival of life on the planet Earth is not actually an intellectual deficit of Indigenous peoples, rather it's a misuse and it's a lack of understanding by largely white Western corporations that have come in and imposed their values on our countries, on our peoples, on our lands, all in the name of modernity, imperialism, development and progress. The economic evolution undertaken across the planet to secure resources and grow profits was never based on sustainable use of available resources and careful management. However, Indigenous intellectualism, built over thousands of generations, maintained a careful balance between scarce resources such as water and the presence of a people whose priorities were and are not materialistic or profit-based, but sustainable and respectful for now and the future. If we move now to the last slide, we can see that this last slide depicts the lands of Australia as First Nations people have always known this continent to look like. And this continues through to today. So Australian lands of waters and waters have been the home for Aboriginal people for over 200 different nations of people for a long time. The Aboriginal people across this continent occupied the lands and utilised its resources for as long as 100,000 years prior to colonial invasion in the 1700s. And the history of colonial invasion is what historians like Henry Reynolds have described as an indelible stain on our modern nation. The health situation for the First Nations peoples of Australia is described by United Nations as an alarmingly and consistently poor status of health, a human rights disgrace. These claims directly link to a continued pattern of racist legislation, policies and practice in our health, legal and education system. And together with the overuse of resources and denial of Indigenous expertise, Australia is definitely at a turning point where it can discard white privilege and resistance, or it can embrace Indigenous knowledge and expertise. And ultimately, it's up to those in power to make these decisions, to continue plundering what little is left to destroy, or to actually turn a different page, make some changes, do some reform that actually embraces Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous expertise that's been around for thousands of generations. And if we put all of that expertise together, the same way that we would measure something like the knowledge capital within a corporation or a business, we're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of years of good, strong service and maintenance to a nation that is still being largely ignored because it's labelled as Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous cultural practices. Thank you. Now I'll complete this presentation.
Yama, my name is Sheelagh Daniels-Mays. I am an Australian Aboriginal woman descended from my mum's Gamilaroi people. I am also vision impaired and a disability activist. I work at the University of Sydney as a lecturer and researcher in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Today I'm going to talk with you about a course I coordinate and teach, INDG 2001, Indigenous Land and Culture. I will briefly share with you what the course is, who undertakes the course, and some key learnings the course aims to teach. In the next slide, we have the synopsis. Now, the abstract I submitted for this presentation is actually a modification of the course synopsis itself. I've highlighted several terms to focus your attention that speak to the concepts, methods, and intended outcomes of the course itself. It is a second-year mandatory course in the Indigenous Studies major offered by the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Undergraduate students from all disciplines of humanities and social sciences can undertake the major as part of their primary degree. As you can see in the synopsis, the course takes a rights-based perspective to explore Indigenous political history and activism in maintaining and protecting country and culture. Overall, the approach I use in teaching the subjects seeks to challenge and disrupt embedded dominant narratives espoused by centuries of racialised colonisation. In the next slide, we have a list of the topics covered in the course. The course runs for 13 weeks, with the first 6 weeks focusing on developing student awareness of Indigenous and Western understandings of culture and land. We travel through a diversity of topics, including place literacies, learning on country, kinship, astronomy, economics. In the second half of the course, the focus expands to more theoretical work locally and globally. Students learn decoloniality through literature, artwork. They learn about the connection to well-being and rights-based frameworks. They learn too of extractive violence from Kristina and explore the idea of land having personhood status in some parts of the world. As noted above, it is a multidisciplinary course for multidisciplinary students. So we have teachers, social workers, architects, linguists, and sometimes we have students who are enrolled from the law school. There are 2 mandatory prerequisites for this course: Introduction to Indigenous Cultures and Introduction to Indigenous History, undertaken in year 1 of their studies. We do learning on country, visiting Aboriginal Sydney, as well as museums. So let's look at some of the key learnings of the course. When we go to the next slide. When I ask students what colonisation is, they have little knowledge beyond the rudimentary, where colonisation is the taking or the stealing of First Peoples lands and all that goes with that. Students have little understanding that colonisation is a process that continues into the present. So we use the work of Filipino social psychologist, Virgilio Enriquez, who gives us 5 stages of colonisation that you can see in this slide. We won't have time to go through all of these today, of course, but the course of Introduction to Indigenous Land and Culture certainly pushes back against, for example, denial, tokenism and exploitation. In the next slide, we look at the idea that if we're going to teach students what colonisation is, they also need to learn what decolonisation involves. And we need to be able to put this in a very clear framework for them to be able to work through. So here we use the work of Hawaiian theorist and activist, Poka Lanui, excuse me for the pronunciation, who gives us 6 phases or stages of decolonisation. In the course, we're doing the work of rediscovery and recovery, of healing, of dreaming, and of commitment and action. We also talk very much about the need for grieving, mourning, and celebration of success. If we move into the next slide, we recognise that the course needs to be placed in the real world, the world beyond the classroom, the 4 walls of that classroom. Students therefore explore opposing understandings and meanings given to land by Western Indigenous peoples. This table is adapted from Robin Wall Kimmerer's work and is used for guiding critical dialogue. A key quote that comes up in that dialogue is given to us by Pat Dodson from 1980. He's an Aboriginal scholar and elder here in Australia. And he explains that a Western person looks at land and asks what we can develop on it and how fast. This idea stands in exact opposition to an Indigenous worldview. Let's move to the next slide. And I want to have a look briefly at an assignment we do, because this is a significant assignment. We try not to just do essays. So in assignment 2, student works in small groups of 3 or 4. And we use the Barani website provided by the City of Sydney Council, with Barani being a Gadigal word, a local Indigenous word for yesterday. We go to the next slide, we'll see a bit more of this website. And students on here, it's an interactive map, so they can work their way through the map according to categories like education, civil rights, early contact, visual arts, etc. We have a rule that there's not to be any double ups so that we get across as many sites as possible. We normally have an enrolment these days of around 40 students. Students visit the chosen site as a group, and following the visit, students present a photographic seminar to their peers, noting what they expected to see, what was the reality when they got there, and what they learned as individuals and as a group. The final part of the assignment is the drafting of a letter to the City of Sydney Council, noting about their visit, and it's a critical piece of writing, and this letter doesn't have to be posted. It's up to the student. But let me say about this assignment, it was a bit of an experiment when we set this assignment up. And what has happened as a result of this assignment is that students tend to return to the classroom, and it normally starts from about week 4 onwards. And they return from their visits disappointed and sometimes very angry, because oftentimes there is either nothing there or only a small plaque at the site. Let me just give you a couple of examples. One site that students often choose to go to is Redfern Park here in Sydney, which is hugely significant for many Aboriginal peoples. but it virtually has nothing there to recognise the significance. And while the Botanic Gardens has a wonderful Indigenous garden area with dual naming, it is seen by students as nearly not enough. It is this assignment that shifts students' consciousness about the ongoing impact of colonisation. But it is an assignment that also teaches students that they need to be the agents of change. This can be through the sending of their draft letter. It can be in their future work. It can be how they are on the land that they live and work. It can be through a number of channels that they start to nominate themselves and explore themselves. They join committees, they do all sorts of things. We also do an excursion at the end of the course on Aboriginal Sydney. And this course shows them what is being achieved and reinforces looking at their surroundings, the country they live on and work on, very differently to how they have in the past. In the next slide, we have a wonderful artwork. Now, this is for Reconciliation Week 2020, and the theme for 2020 is "We are in this together." And it's got a very different meaning at the moment, but this theme was done long before COVID-19 came along. What I realise here is, and why I've put this up, is that we're in it together, absolutely. But students need to know what they are committing to and why. And this is what the course seeks to do. We'll go to the final slide. And here I've just provided some of the readings that we use in the course, and I invite you to continue your learning and go and investigate some of these readings. That's your future challenge, and I thank you for listening.
Okay, I just want to share this song with you. This is a chant that's associated with Adyamatna knowledge of fire and fire making. And it tells you how to make a fire and what items to use. So this is how it goes. Apa wuti wuti wuti, apa wuti wuti wuti, ata puti puti puti, ata puti puti puti, ata puti puti puti. Apro wudna virrika virrika virrika, iti wudna virrika virrika virrika, apro wudna virrika virrika virrika, iti wudna virrika virrika virrika.
Perfect. Thank you, Jillian.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Jillian.
you so much for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have a little group discussion as a part of this organised session called Extractivism Through a Wider Lens, Invisible Implications and Current Consequences. I'm so grateful that all of you could participate, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on these issues myself.
Thank you.
So I'll leave the floor open. We have obviously a bit of an imbalance. I'm currently here on reindeer grazing land in Sápmi, and we have Jillian in Melbourne and Sheelagh in Sydney and Melissa in Adelaide. So there might be a lot more Australian perspectives here. But I for one, have been thinking about the international differences and similarities when I've been listening to your fantastic talks today.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why in the course that I coordinate and teach, we've set it up so that we have that last 6 weeks that really focus on the local and the global, because there are distinct differences that we talk about in the first 6 weeks, but there are so many similarities, there are so many lessons that we can learn. And I think one of the strengths of the course is being able to bring in guest speakers like yourself from around Australia, from overseas, who are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, because bringing those stories together is what brings the strength to the course. It really, you can start to see students waking up, I think, is how I would put it. And I mean, I think one of the greatest compliments we got out of that course once with feedback was, this course helped me find my political voice. And that is something that I think we need around the world. It's not just within one country and then it stops there.
I agree. One of the things that struck me is this idea of extraction. I don't think I've probably contexted my work using that particular term before, so I found all of your papers very interesting from that perspective. But one of the issues I think that is an international issue as well is that idea of appropriation of knowledge. So one of the things that I feel is that in the advancing in a way of policymakers or are trying to privilege Indigenous voices are in fact doing the opposite, because when they go out and say, oh, this is great, we're going to pay attention to Indigenous knowledge and move it into environmental change and adaptation now, they still want to take that knowledge and use it for wider benefit, which in itself is not a bad thing if it's a truly collaborative thing. But the autonomy and agency of Indigenous peoples and their rights to that knowledge and how they themselves are going to use it to keep themselves safe, I think is underestimated. And I think, you know, some of the ideas around extraction help explain there's that persistence still in contemporary environmental management to take Indigenous knowledge when it's palatable and chuck it into environmental management in wider regimes, but not actually say, what do you think and how are you going to be the leading party or a collaborator in a more equitable, coexistent knowledge system.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that came to mind when I was listening to Sheelagh's talk, but yeah, also what you're saying too, Melissa, and I think this resonates really nicely with what you've already covered, is for me the importance of a revitalisation process taking place that enables us to, as Sheelagh says, find our voice, have our voices heard, and be part of a respectful and safe space in which to share our wisdom. And I think that definitely universities and schools and the education that takes place does have its benefits, but it is still highly problematic in lots of ways. And I know this from my own experience of teaching Indigenous studies at university level, where often things are rushed, often they're disjointed. Sheelagh, you were saying how you have prerequisites that give some background for students before they come to your subject.
Yeah,
I teach in subjects. My experience has been, whether it's at second year or undergraduate, or whether it's final year of a master's program, I find myself in these situations constantly where I have students coming to my subjects, to my units, and they don't actually have any background at all. So you feel like you have to do the baby steps with them first to be able to move them through a properly anchored and a properly grounded understanding before you can even start the discussion and before you can even start the critical analysis, the reflection and the reflexivity that's required then for each individual student to actually have some agency. So I think that there's a lot of work still to be done. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned too is how one of the problems I think that happens when we try to enact this revitalisation process is that often there's a commoditisation process that takes place where money becomes the biggest the biggest hand, the biggest dealer, the biggest priority, and then everything else has to fit around that. I think that's just critical to recognise it.
I'll just say quickly that the Masters, Indigenous Studies Master major and the Indigenous Studies minor is fairly new at the University of Sydney. It's only been around for 3 or 4 years, and we've wrestled it back into Aboriginal hands. And as a team, we've been able to layer and scaffold the knowledge from year 1, year 2, year 3. And the other thing that is a rude shock to, I'd say, 90% of students is that attendance at all scheduled teaching, so lectures and seminars, is mandatory. It's not optional. You can't do it online. You have to turn up. And we've had to change that this year, of course, with COVID. But you have to turn up, because otherwise you end up with the problem that Jillian's talking about. There's gaps in knowledge because they haven't been there for all the other weeks.
Yeah.
So this is really vital, that you have to show up.
Yeah. And if I can hop in with a bit of an international perspective on this, it's really interesting, as I've lived in both Australia and Sweden, but it's really, really interesting to have the experience of how in Australia you have come so far when it comes to this. And yet there are obviously these problems. But in Sweden, we have only 2 universities that teach courses specifically on Sami language. Sami culture and history is still so marginalised in our educational system. When my children go to school here, they learn little or nothing about Sami society, history and culture. When they went to school in Australia, they learned so much, both from Aboriginal peers in the school. There was an Aboriginal language teacher at the school. There was so many activities during Reconciliation Week that were really empowering. Assembly at Reconciliation Week, the Aboriginal children at the school welcomed everybody to assembly using their own language and their own cultures. That is nothing that I have ever seen in Sweden. And most often when we talk about these things in Sweden, when I lecture, then someone will raise their hands and they'll say, you know, I actually know nothing about this, the Sami people. So this is deeply worrying and very, very sad. And it sort of makes me feel like I'm a bit behind in these discussions, because where you are starting up here, there is education. I can't find a single Australian university that doesn't have courses relating to Indigenous Australians. Somehow. They might not be good, but they exist.
No. The sad thing, though, too, is that your children went to an extremely active and school, and we still find first-year students who are, you know, age 19, 20, coming to university just fresh from school, who have learned pretty much nothing beyond the movie of Rabbit Proof Fence or the movie of 10 Canoes. Have learned nothing, really. Unless they've been one of the gifted students who's been allowed to do Aboriginal studies in year 11 and 12 as an elective. And it is for gifted students that you have to have certain grades to be able to do it. So we still get a high proportion of students coming to university who have no foundation knowledge, and you have to do that baby stuff that Jillian was talking about. We still have to talk about what the meaning of the Aboriginal flag is, or who David Unipen is, and all that basic knowledge that Australians don't seem to have. So that's what we're trying to do with these Indigenous Studies majors, for example, is to up that. I mean, I'm always talking about infiltrating. So what my picture in my head is about creating social workers, teachers, linguists, historians, architects who will go out into the workforce, and it's like secret agent sleepers. They will go out there with this knowledge and start hopefully doing policy differently. Will start hopefully doing archaeology differently because they have this consciousness around Indigenous and knowledges, and that they're real knowledges. They're, as Jillian was saying, thousands of generations of knowledge. So this is my secret plan that's now not so secret.
Can I ask Melissa and also Jillian, is it because Australia is divided in states and territories, how does this work across the country as a whole?
Jillian, do you want
Well, I guess I can speak from the point of view of when I was working in the Northern Territory, particularly in Alice Springs. I found that because I was working in the Central Australian Aboriginal Legal Aid Service, a lot of their area that they cover is across borders. So it includes pockets of Western Australia, pockets of the Northern Territory, and pockets of South Australia. And it's a similar issue as what you find in health service provisions, where health service providers are trying to provide a service across different jurisdictions. And so there are different legislative and policy guidelines that they need to try and follow. And often it's very, very frustrating. And it means that there's more emphasis placed on trying to abide by and access services based on colonially imposed borders than there is on trying to provide an appropriate level of service to Aboriginal people who probably come from 5 or 6 or 10 different nations. So they may have potentially 10 different language groups, 10 different cultural backgrounds that they come from, and they may not even be from one of those areas. They might be from several. So often multilingualism is just one of the issues that Aboriginal people face, but so too is it an issue for someone trying to provide a service. And I think this is exactly the same sort of frustration we face when we're trying to deal with things like impact assessment and environmental issues. We're finding the same thing where we have different sets of legislative requirements, national interest having the right over local or regional or state-based interests, and often it's just a handball that gets tossed around to suit industry and to suit government. It's never about how do we deal with this in a place-based or localised way first, and then work outwards from there. The central component is always around what is the most efficient and fast-tracked process that we can use that's going to validate what industry and government want, and make sure that happens as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that's the words of Pat Dodson that I read out, that it's, we look at the land and we say, what can we build on it and how fast?
Yes, exactly. We're going to have to, sorry, Melissa, I'm going to let you in, but we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. So word goes to Melissa.
I was just going to say, picking up on what Jillian and Sheelagh was saying, is I think part of the issue is that too often the idea of engaging Aboriginal people across Australia and Torres Strait Islanders or Indigenous peoples generally is about going in and saying, how can I talk you into this endeavour? Not going in, and this is also in research, right from the very beginning, saying it's if you're genuine in your intent, then you genuinely have to share power, you genuinely have to share creativity, you genuinely have to share the inception of ideas leading towards a collaboration. And I think a lot of engagement occurs way too late, and it's not even really engagement, it should be a working partnership. So I think picking up on what's been said, that's part of how the processes of extraction get reproduced. It's just going in and saying, have I got an idea for you? I'm going to talk you into it. Or what would you like to bring? And preferably, I'd like the culturally palatable stuff that you bring to this discussion. And I'm going to ignore what your actual needs are. And I guess I'll end on an insight I've had from, I used to, my very first job was going to Cairns and working for TAFE and training Aboriginal rangers across their country in the Cape York. And obviously I learnt a lot from that. But one of the things that always struck me is that, you know, there's all these Indigenous rangers across country who have incredible amount of knowledge. They're living on country in places that, you know, white rangers aren't going to go. They don't know how to manage that country. It's all being managed, but the institutional structures would still not give those rangers the equivalent powers of surveillance and enforcement as the non-Indigenous rangers had, who had a lot less knowledge about how to manage that country. So it's sort of those sort of unevennesses which still occur, which are still based on this idea that Western scientific knowledge is really superior, because if they really believed that Indigenous knowledge had something to offer, they would have given Indigenous rangers those powers. So I think there's lots of examples that are emblematic of both the really positive, beautiful things about collaborating in environmental management. And I think in Australia there are many beautiful instances of proper collaboration on country and in cities. But I think also they're good examples of how we're still hamstrung today by those processes of extraction. And probably, I don't want to speak for the world, but internationally, I think there are resonances there in lots of other contexts as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we'll need to wrap up, but I wanted to ask everyone, and I'll just quickly go first, but just a few words to end on a positive note, if we can. Just a few thoughts from everyone on things that can be done. I'll go first, and then I'll hand over. But I was asked, actually, back in 2013 to look into lateral violence in Indigenous communities. And I then said no, I would never dare do that. It's taken me about, 5 or 6 years until I actually dared say, okay, you've asked many times, I will do this now. So there's that thing about being invited to do something or being asked to do something as a researcher, which I think is a fantastic thing, and I think it's a really strong thing. It is also really, really daunting. But I wanted to leave on that. I think that looking at causes of lateral violence, which I talked about today, I think that is really, really important, and it is also something that has been called for by Indigenous communities to do. So I wanted to leave on that note. That is a work that I want to do and that I think can actually be useful. Yes. Next one.
Melissa, probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
I might just, so I guess I just wanted to end by saying that from my perspective, with the work that I've undertaken, working with Indigenous communities in Australia, I think I personally feel incredibly privileged. And I think it's really important for there to be nuanced understandings of what's actually happening, and to kind of move out of the stereotypical representations, both positive and negative. And I feel like the work that I do, and I hope helps communicate that between different parties. And I genuinely believe that in Australia, we have led the way in the last 20 years in all sorts of models of Indigenous-driven environmental management, whether it's, the fact there are 800 Indigenous rangers across 100 ranger stations in Australia, to Indigenous protected areas, various models of co-management, and now a very diverse suite of climate adaptation responses. And I think that non-Indigenous communities have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples but not in a stereotyped way. And I guess that's kind of what I'm interested in, because I think there's so much dynamism and creativity there that is born of the fact people have been living here for 60, 70,000 years. But those people are also now dealing with new challenges, climate challenges, and also feral weeds and animals, etc., and leading the way in those models. So I think that's the real positive for me, and that's why I keep working in that area, because I think I'm invited to do so. But wow, you know, the country you see, the people you meet, who wouldn't want to do it?
Thank you. Jillian.
Yes, my positive end note is about process. And for me, process is about is teaching students to be critically reflective, and also then to be prepared to actually take on some responsibility. So to think and act in a way that's critically reflective, culturally responsive, and also reflexive, so that there's actually some follow-up, some action, some responsibility, because we've had far too much talk about what should be done or what could be done, and nowhere near enough good, well-informed action that's culturally responsive. So that's what I teach my students. But when it comes to my family, my community, my elders, and the way that I work with them and the young people in my community, for me, it's about empowerment. How do I help them reach that sense of empowerment? How do I help build relationships of trust and confidence so that they can actually find their voice, exert their voice, and be heard and be listened to and be respected?
Thank you. And a few words from you, Sheelagh.
I'll come from the standpoint of being a teacher. I'm a high school teacher, but also university teacher. Look, I gave at the end of my presentation a list of some of the readings we use in the course, including publications from Kristina and from Jillian. And I really strongly encourage people to go and familiarise themselves with at least some of that literature. But as I said also, learning is more than book learning. It's more than classroom four walls. It's about learning on country. So once lockdown's done and dusted and you're travelling to Australia, or we're allowed to move around Australia, start looking for the Aboriginal history of where you are, or the culture there. What's the museums? What's the art galleries there? What's the tours? I mean, a lot of people don't know that we have a business called Tribal Warrior, and I'm not an owner of this, so I have nothing to gain financially from saying this, but Tribal Warrior is the only Aboriginal-owned harbour cruise in Sydney, and it's a fantastic way of learning about Sydney Harbour prior to 1788, as well as through the centuries. And you've got books like Marsh Langton, who's done a fantastic book on Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tourism to have a look at. But find different ways of engaging with this country is what I'm saying, both scholarly and on country itself.
Fantastic. And that, of course, goes for all Indigenous nations. So when you visit Sápmi,
absolutely,
Sweden, come and learn from reindeer herders. Come and learn from Sami that aren't reindeer herders as well.
Yeah, no other way to travel as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks to all of us.